Hi guys, in this video I'm going to talk about tensors and graphs. So basically tensors are n-dimensional matrices in Tensorflow. So here's an example. This is the same example of the previous video. Let's take a look at the previous example. So in here we had two inputs, but now we have only one input, which is a tensor. So this tensor is an array of two numbers, 4 and 3, and you can send this array to different operations in your graph. So let's do this in Tensorflow. Alright, so what we need to do is we need to create this one, which is a is equal to tf.constant of, and now the input is going to be 4 and 3. And the name is going to be a constant. Now we need to create this b operation. So let's go to b is equal to tf dot so b is going to be addition of the elements of this tensor. So it should be reduce sum of a, and let's give it a name, which is going to be sum b. Let's be consistent over here and constant a. How about c? C is going to be tf dot reduce prod of a, and the name is going to be alt c. Now d is going to be multiplication of b and c. tf dot b and c, and name is going to be d. We did the same thing as over here, but only using a Tensorflow, which makes things simpler. Now, now in the previous video we talked about creating graphs in TensorBoard, but we only use the terminal. Now let's we can also do it inside the script. So let's do it inside the script this time. So sess for session, ef dot session with a cap s, and let's say this writer is going to be tf dot train dot summary writer. Now let's put it in my graph. Says dot graph. And now you need to run this using terminal. Eventually you are going to have to use the terminal. Properties. This is where it's located. I'm going to need it for the terminal. Tensors and graphs.py. Python. Paste the location. Tensors. Can you help me? Yep. Alright, so if I run this, now I need to call TensorBoard. TensorBoard log dir is going to be my graph. Alright, so it's on port 6006. Localhost 6006. Alright, so this is our new graph. Constant A is going as an input to some B, mul C, and then they are being multiplied with each other to create the D. Right. We can't create tensors from Python native types, which was what we did over here. Let me be a bit more specific. So this is a native type. I'm just going to cut this part over here and put the name over here. Now this is a tensor, which is basically a Python native type, but we are using it as a tensor over here in this input. Now I can run this. Yes, I need to do Control C to break out of this. Alright, so let's do the same thing. And it should work. Now this is available again. Alright, so you get the idea of how to create tensors using Python native types. So this will be a 0D tensor. This is going to be a 1D tensor, and here is a 2D tensor. In here we did a 1D tensor, which is NT. We can also use NumPy. So we need to import NumPy. So NumPy is a computational package for manipulating n-dimensional arrays in Python. So to use that, we need to import it. So over here, import NumPy as np. Now we can use it. In here, this is a 0-dimensional tensor. So we want a 1-dimensional tensor over here. So we need to use something like this. Let's say NumPy tensor is going to be np.array 4 and 3. Yeah, you can give it a data type, and it's good practice to do so. So I'm just going to use this for integer. D type is going to np.int32. D type np.int32. Now I want to use this inside my code. So this is a tensor which I'm using NumPy to create. Alright, so again Control C, interrupt, and then this one. Now again this one. Now we can go to Python, Firefox over here and see the result. Localhost 6. And it's basically the same thing. There's no difference. So what I want to do over here is I want to go to home, my graph. I've created multiple graphs over here. I'm just going to delete them because it's giving me warnings saying that there are multiple graphs over there. Alright, so what's next? So we created a one-dimensional tensor using NumPy. You can also create two-dimensional and three-dimensional tensor shapes. Alright, so tensor shape is basically determining the shape of a tensor. If you have a one-dimensional tensor, the shape is going to be the length of the tensor. If you have a two-dimensional tensor, the shape would be length in the first dimension and length in the second dimension. So let's assume that you have a vector of length 3, so the shape is going to be 3. If you have a matrix, a 3 by 2 matrix, your shape would look like this: 3 and 2. 3 is for the length of the first dimension, and 2 is length of the second dimension. So yeah, so let's go to the next one. You can do TensorFlow operations using these operators instead of using add or sub, you know, the names. But the downside for these operators is that you can't give it a name. So in here, you would have x and y and a name. But if you use it like this, it won't have any name. TensorFlow graphs are a set of tensors and operations. There are some functions that we can use to manipulate these graphs. So the first one is this getDefaultGraph. So it will give you a handle of the default graph. This one is asDefault. asDefault is a context manager which overrides the current default graph for the lifetime of the context. For our purposes, it will always be used inside a with block to modify graphs. And this command creates a new graph. So tf.graph creates a new graph. So let's do this in Python. Import TensorFlow as tf. Alright, G is going to be tf.graph. cap G. Now this is how you manipulate G. If you don't do this, it will manipulate the default graph. So with G as default, now we can create nodes for the new graph. So C is going to be equal to tf.constant 30. C is going to be equal to tf.constant 30. You could also double check if c.graph is indeed equal to G. Assert c.graph is G. Right. Alright, so you need to be careful about the default graph and the graph that you create, so you don't want to mix them up. In this code, this node will go into the default graph, but this one will go into G. Of course, you need to define G first. Again, so this one again will go to default graph because we're not using with block. Let's do this in Python. In default graph is going to be equal to tf add 1 and 2. tf.add 1 and 2. Let's give it a name. In default graph. And with G dot as default in graph G is going to be tf dot 2 and 3. Name is going to be in graph G. Now that we're outside with block, if we do this, also this will also be inside the default graph. So also in diff graph, it's going to be tf dot, let's say 5 and 1, and the name is going to be also in default. Alright, so let's create a graph. Let's see the output. Writer is equal to be tf.train summary writer. Let's put it in my graph, and we need to create a session. And run it. Now let's go over here and Control C so this one should, what's the name? Graph.py. Alright, so it's given us an error. Line 4, tf.constant, expected and indented block. Alright, so line 4. Apparently indentation is important. Alright, so let's indent this one also. Alright, as default. Let's get back over here. As underscore default, yep. And over here. Attribute error. Alright, so this is not an attribute, it's a function. So let's do this again. Graph is not callable. Which line is it? Line 5. Maybe this. Let's see. See that graph is G. Alright, so I'm not supposed to use it like a function. This is how you call it. No, don't call it. Let's get rid of this one. All right. Okay. Right, so this is the default graph. In default graph, also in default graph. So if we were to do it, so if we were to output G, so this would be like this. Alright, so let's do Control C to break out of this, and we need to run it first. And then now it will give us a warning because we have more than one graph, which we can avoid. Home, my graph. Alright, so we need to do Control C. Rerun it. No warning. Alright. Let's take a look at the graphs in graph G. Okay, looks good. So when dealing with graphs, you have two correct ways of doing it. So you can either create new graphs and ignore the default graph, just like this. So we've created 2 new graphs by calling this graph function, and then we use them using this with block. The second way is to get a handle to the default graph, like this. So G1 is going to be my default graph, and G2 is going to be my new graph, which I created using this graph function call. But what you don't want to do is mixing default graph and user created graph. So this is the incorrect way to do this. So you've created this new graph called G1, and you set G1 as default. So in here what you're doing is overriding the default graph. That's not what you want to do. So in this video we've covered tensors and graphs. In the next video we will cover sessions. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you found this video useful. Thank you.